That dress violates decency. Take it off! Leave the street!
Touch her again, and you'll regret it.
Your wife's dress is indecent. The clipboard queen's words cut through the summer air like a blade, and every neighbor within earshot froze. My pregnant wife, Sarah, stood at the edge of our driveway, her hands instinctively folding over her belly. She wore a simple cotton maternity dress, pale blue, soft against the July heat. Nothing obscene, nothing threatening, just comfort for a woman carrying life. But Elaine Winters, the so-called president of Brookhaven Meadows, saw an opportunity. Her crimson blazer gleamed beneath the sun, her sunglasses reflecting back the silent crowd that watched from porches and windows. She lifted her clipboard like it was scripture. "This violates community standards," she said. The enforcer in crimson thought she was unstoppable. What she didn't expect was the steel standing next to Sarah. I stepped forward, forcing her to look at me instead of my wife. My voice came low, sharp enough to slice through her smugness. "That clause you're hiding behind, it doesn't exist anymore. It was struck down 2 years ago." Her painted smile twitched. Just for a second. Enough for me to see the crack in her armor. The neighbors whispered, their voices carrying like dry leaves in the wind. Sarah shifted closer to me, her eyes glistening, her body trembling under the weight of humiliation. And in that moment, every promise I'd ever made surged back, especially the one I made to my father before he died. Protect them. Protect her. Protect this family, no matter what. That oak tree in my yard, the one my father planted the year I was born, stood tall behind us, its branches fanning out like sentinels. It wasn't just wood and leaves, it was legacy. It was memory. It was strength. And today, it was the line I refused to let her cross. Elaine tilted her head, as if she'd regained her confidence, her pearl earrings catching the light. "Mr. Carter, failure to comply will result in escalating fines. This is your only warning." I felt Sarah's grip on my arm, her voice breaking into a whisper. "Michael, don't let her—" I cut her off, stepping between them. "She's not writing you up, Sarah. Not today. Not ever." The tyrant in heels smirked again, a performance for the crowd watching from their porches. She thrived on fear, on silence, on humiliation, and for a long time, the neighbors had let her play queen. But fear doesn't rule forever. That's when I turned, my voice rising just enough to reach the edges of the cul-de-sac. If you've ever felt that surge of power when standing up to bullies, hit subscribe now, because this showdown is about to become a masterclass in fighting back. Eyes shifted, phones tilted, curtains twitched. The silence was cracking, and she knew it. I locked back on her, steady as concrete. "You think a clipboard makes you untouchable, but I've spent 20 years dismantling structures that looked unbreakable, and yours is already showing fractures." For a heartbeat, she didn't answer. The officer of rules clutched her clipboard tighter, her knuckles whitening. The mask was slipping. And then the retaliation came. "Your wife will be inspected daily until compliance is achieved. That's final." She turned to the crowd, smirking again, as if my defiance had been nothing but theater. But I wasn't acting. I was calculating. I wasn't just another homeowner. I was Michael Carter, licensed civil engineer and contractor. I didn't just know how to build. I knew how to expose weakness. I'd spent my life walking job sites, finding cracks nobody else could see, making corporations pay for ignoring codes. And now, my skills weren't just about concrete or steel. They were about my family, my wife, my unborn child. The enforcer in crimson thought she had the upper hand. She had no idea I'd already spotted her fault lines. The clubhouse she worshipped, the electrical systems she ignored, the fire codes she never checked. Her empire wasn't built on strength. It was built on neglect, and neglect crumbles under pressure. Sarah's hand pressed into mine, trembling but certain. I glanced back at her swollen belly, and rage burned hot in my chest. She wasn't just carrying a child. She was carrying my future, my father's legacy, our family's hope. And no one, certainly not some clipboard queen drunk on authority, was going to strip her of her dignity. The neighbors still stayed silent, but their silence had shifted. They weren't complicit anymore. They were watching, waiting, wondering how far I'd take this. Elaine Winters thought she'd humiliated us today. She thought she'd branded Sarah with shame. But what she didn't realize, what she couldn't realize, was that humiliation cuts both ways. And when the time came, her own rules would bury her. Because I wasn't just defending my wife, I was dismantling her entire kingdom. And the first crack had already formed. The crack I'd seen in her confidence didn't take long to spread. By the next morning, the clipboard queen had shifted from threats at my driveway to plastering her decree across the neighborhood. Bright red flyers were taped to mailboxes, slipped under doors, pinned to the clubhouse bulletin board. At the top, bold letters shouted, "Decency Code Enforcement." Sarah's name wasn't printed, but the language was surgical. Maternity attire must not display contours that offend community standards. Everyone knew who it was aimed at. Everyone knew the tyrant in heels had chosen her target. I ripped one from the oak tree in my front yard, the same tree my father planted before he died, and held it in my hands. Its bark had weathered storms and years of HOA vanity projects, but now it bore their poison ink. My stomach twisted. That tree wasn't just shade, it was memory, promise, continuity. To see it violated with her propaganda was almost worse than the words themselves. Sarah tried to be strong. She stood at the kitchen sink that morning, her blue dress flowing like any other summer day. "It's just paper, Michael," she said quietly. But her hands trembled as she rinsed a dish. She couldn't hide the sting. Not from me. When we stepped outside, the impact was already visible. Neighbors avoided our eyes. Some shifted their lawn chairs, facing away from our porch, as if turning their backs could erase what they'd seen. Others lingered, reading the flyers with tight jaws, but saying nothing. Fear had made them spectators in their own homes. The enforcer in crimson thrived on this silence. Every posted reminder was a performance, and the audience's stillness was her applause. She believed she'd turned the community into her chorus, all humming her same poisonous tune. But even in silence, I saw fractures forming. Mrs. Davenport, who lived 3 doors down, clutched her flyer so tightly her knuckles whitened. Mr. Lee, usually a proud supporter of Elaine's regime, tore his copy into strips before retreating into his garage. They weren't ready to speak, but something in their body language told me they were choking on her rules. That's when I realized this wasn't just about Sarah. This was about every neighbor who'd been shamed, fined, or humiliated under the clipboard queen's reign. My wife was just the latest, and maybe the most vulnerable target, but the rot had spread far deeper. Walking past the clubhouse that evening, I stopped. Its polished brick exterior and manicured hedges looked pristine under the fading sun. But I knew the truth. The building was a facade, one I'd walked through enough times to see past the paint. I remembered exposed wiring near the kitchen, a cracked support beam hidden in the back hallway, sprinklers that hadn't been tested in years. My engineer's eyes couldn't unsee it. The officer of rules had chosen humiliation as her weapon. I was beginning to see mine, not fists, not shouting, facts, codes, inspections, the very things her empire pretended to enforce but ignored when it suited her. That night, Sarah sat across from me at the dining table, exhaustion shadowing her face. "She won't stop, Michael, not until she breaks me." Her voice wavered, and that cut deeper than any fine or threat. I leaned forward, steady. "No, she's already overreached. And overreach leaves evidence." The words hung in the air, heavy but certain. For Sarah, it was reassurance. For me, it was resolve. I could feel it. The storm she'd unleashed was gathering momentum, but storms don't just destroy. They reveal what was weak all along. The clipboard queen thought she'd won another round. In truth, she'd only drawn the community's eyes to her obsession. And when the curtain lifted, they wouldn't see a ruler. They'd see decay. Because humiliation can't survive daylight. And I was about to bring the floodlights. By the end of the week, the flyers had multiplied. They fluttered like crimson warnings against the neat fences of Brookhaven Meadows. Every morning, I found one taped to the oak tree, and every morning I tore it down. But that didn't erase the damage. The whispers had spread, louder now, staining Sarah's daily walks with eyes and silence. The board chair wasn't satisfied with paper campaigns. She wanted theater. Saturday afternoon, she staged it. A so-called neighborhood standards gathering in front of the clubhouse. I arrived with Sarah at my side, her hand gripping mine tighter than usual. The crowd stood in clusters, some openly curious, others uneasy. At the center, the tyrant in heels perched on the clubhouse steps, clipboard balanced against her palm like a gavel. She scanned the group as if she owned every breath taken on that pavement. When Sarah stepped into view, her lips curled into that familiar, venomous smile. But among the sea of faces, one man stood out. Tom Alvarez, the treasurer, positioned slightly behind her, shoulders stiff, jaw clenched. His eyes darted between Elaine's posture of command and Sarah's quiet defiance. He didn't join in the nodding or the whispered approval. Instead, his hand tightened around the folder he carried, so firmly I thought the cardboard might tear. Elaine's voice sliced through the humid air. "We uphold standards here. Decency isn't optional." Her words landed heavy, but as she spoke, Tom shifted. His foot tapped once against the concrete, then stopped abruptly. He glanced down, avoiding her eyes. I caught that. The clipboard queen thrived on loyalty, on treasurers and secretaries nodding like obedient soldiers. But Tom's silence wasn't loyalty. It was torment. His gaze drifted again, this time towards Sarah, then away, guilt flickering across his face like a shadow he couldn't shake. Neighbors watched in silence, some arms crossed in defense, others folded as if ashamed. The enforcer in crimson spread her arms wide, soaking in the moment. But it was Tom's stillness that burned into me, the sweat on his temple, the way he adjusted his collar twice in less than a minute, the almost imperceptible shake of his head when she emphasized the word indecent. He knew. Maybe not everything, but enough. Enough to make him fidget while the woman who called herself protector of standards humiliated a pregnant woman in front of her neighbors. Sarah's fingers dug into my palm, her nails sharp with unspoken anger. I whispered, "Don't give her the satisfaction." Elaine continued, her voice rising. "When one household refuses compliance, it endangers the values of us all." But the words rang hollow to me now, because as she spoke, I wasn't just listening to her. I was watching Tom. The officer of rules stepped down from the steps, striding toward us like she was descending from a throne. "Michael, your wife's attire." But her voice blurred, because in that moment, I saw Tom's lips part, just slightly, as if words fought to escape. He pressed them shut, grinding his teeth, his knuckles whitening around the folder. He wanted to speak, but fear held him. Fear of her, fear of exposure. When the gathering ended, neighbors drifted away in murmurs. Elaine basked in what she believed was victory, chin high, heels clicking against the pavement. But Tom lingered. He placed the folder under his arm and turned sharply, almost bumping into me. His eyes locked on mine for the briefest moment, haunted, conflicted, restless. It wasn't alliance yet, but it was fracture, and fracture spread. Back at home, Sarah exhaled shakily. "She won't stop, Michael. You saw her." I nodded, but my mind wasn't on Elaine. It was on Tom Alvarez, the man trapped between loyalty and conscience. Because if my instincts were right, the treasurer's silence wasn't just weakness. It was evidence waiting to be freed. And sooner or later, silence always cracks. By Monday morning, the war left no corner untouched. A notice slipped under my door before sunrise, printed in bold red, 250 to fine, indecent exposure violation. Beneath it, a threat, each day of non-compliance would double the penalty. The clipboard queen wasn't content humiliating Sarah in public. Now she wanted to drain us in private, bleeding us line by line through fabricated charges. I walked to the driveway and found 3 more flyers taped to the oak tree. The same tree my father planted decades ago, the one that grew alongside this house, roots sunk deep into Brookhaven soil. The tyrant in heels had no idea what she was trying to uproot. Sarah stood behind me, one hand cradling her stomach. Her voice wavered, but not with weakness. "If they think this will scare us." She trailed off, her lips pressed thin, anger boiling beneath her calm. The neighbors noticed too. By noon, whispers circled about new letters arriving at their doors, reminders of decency codes, citations for lawn decorations, fines for trash bins left a few minutes past pickup. The enforcer in crimson had turned the entire neighborhood into her stage, but now the script was shifting. Fear was there, Yes, but so was resentment. I saw it in Mrs. Lee, the quiet widow down the block, folding up her own warning notice with trembling hands. I saw it in the Johnson kids pulling down the flyers that had been slapped on their garage. The officer of rules had overplayed her hand. She wasn't enforcing order anymore. She was manufacturing chaos. That evening, I confronted the fine, not in anger, but in resolve. I laid the paper flat on my desk and studied it the way I'd study a blueprint. As an engineer, every flaw mattered. The phrasing was vague, the code's reference didn't exist in municipal statutes, and the formatting looked rushed, sloppy. It wasn't official, it was theater. And theater had cracks. But the real weight pressed on Sarah. Each walk outside now felt like a parade of shame. Neighbors staring not because they believed the lies, but because they feared being next. She carried that burden silently, her dignity bruised by the stares. Watching her retreat indoors each afternoon carved into me deeper than the fines ever could. Late that night, I heard the shuffle of papers outside. I cracked the blinds just enough to see a figure under the dim streetlight. Tom Alvarez. He wasn't distributing flyers. He was collecting them, pulling them down one by one, shoving them into a bag as if he couldn't bear their presence any longer. He moved quickly, glancing over his shoulder. The conflicted treasurer wasn't ready to take a stand, but he couldn't stomach Elaine's crusade either. His hands shook as he tore down the last flyer near my driveway. Before he left, he looked at the oak tree, lingering there for a moment like he understood its weight. Then he disappeared into the night. I didn't tell Sarah, not yet. But my instincts sharpened. The cracks in Elaine's power were widening. Tom was proof of it. The next morning, another letter arrived. This one wasn't just a fine. It was a notice of property lien consideration if the balance wasn't paid. It was a bluff, but an ugly one. She was escalating, desperate to make an example out of us. And in that desperation, she was giving me exactly what I needed, mistakes to dismantle her with. Because an empire built on fear doesn't collapse with a single blow. It collapses piece by piece, each lie unraveling under its own weight. And Elaine Winters, no matter how high she stacked her rules, was about to learn what happens when you push a carter too far. The clubhouse had always been Elaine's pride piece, the gleaming jewel of Brookhaven Meadows. Every HOA meeting, every staged community celebration, every intimidation speech. She made sure it happened there, under her banners, beneath the lights she bragged about installing. That's why I walked straight through its glass doors that Tuesday evening, heart pounding, but eyes sharp. If she was going to weaponize the building as a fortress, I wanted to know what it was really built on. Inside, the air reeked of bleach and stage perfection. Posters about community standards lined the walls. But my eyes weren't on the paper. They were on the wires trailing along the ceiling, the panel boxes poorly mounted, the scorched mark near one corner light that screamed, "Overload." The officer of rules wanted control, but she hadn't bothered to follow the very codes she enforced. I crouched by the main breaker, tracing the conduits. The connections were spliced with hardware store caps, not commercial-grade fittings. Worse, the load distribution wasn't balanced. Half the clubhouse could ignite if those circuits pushed beyond capacity. As an engineer, it was second nature to map flaws like this. And these weren't minor oversights. They were violations, each one capable of stripping her authority the way fire strips paint. But what really stopped me was the sprinkler system. The pipes ran wrong, angled too sharply, installed with improper valves. In an actual fire, the system would fail within seconds. Elaine's throne room wasn't just non-compliant, it was a hazard. I stood there, staring at the ceiling, the memory of my father pressing into me. He used to say buildings carry secrets, but they always speak if you know how to listen. And this clubhouse was screaming. Sarah's safety, my unborn child's future, even our neighbors' lives. She had gambled all of them away just to tighten her grip. Footsteps echoed behind me. I straightened, every muscle tight. It wasn't Elaine, it was Tom Alvarez, clutching a folder against his chest like a shield. His eyes darted toward the breaker I'd just examined. He hesitated, then whispered, "You see it too, don't you?" I said nothing. But the look in my eyes must have told him everything. His shoulders sagged. For a moment I thought he'd bolt. Instead, he adjusted his glasses and muttered, "She cut corners everywhere, always has, no permits, no inspections. She said no one would ever call her bluff." The clipboard queen's house of cards had a foundation of rotten wood. Before I could press him further, Tom stiffened. A shadow stretched across the wall, the tyrant in the heels, entering through the far door, clipboard tucked like a weapon. Her eyes scanned the room, locking on Tom, then me. Her voice dripped with authority. "Trespassing in board property, Michael? That's another fine." I stayed silent, but my mind raced. If she wanted to call this her property, let her. Every violation in these walls would be tied directly to her. As she barked orders, Tom froze, his jaw clenched. His hands shook so badly I thought the folder might slip. That folder, if it was what I thought it was, might hold the proof to everything. But I couldn't push him here. Not under her stare. Not while she prowled like a hawk. So, I walked out calmly, her threats trailing behind me. On the outside, I gave her nothing. But inside, the plan was already forming, because now I had what I needed. Leverage. Evidence not from a garage, not from rumor, but from the bones of the building itself. Elaine Winters had played at being judge and jury, but her fortress was a tinderbox, and when the first match dropped, she wouldn't be the one holding it. By Wednesday morning, our street looked like a battlefield without smoke. Flyers littered driveways and mailboxes, official-looking notices stamped with red ink. Decency review pending. Neighbors bent to pick them up, their eyes darting between the paper and our house, as if we'd already been convicted. Sarah tried to brush it off, smoothing her maternity dress with trembling hands. But the whispering across fences told another story. Elaine's poison was spreading. The clipboard queen had upped her game. At noon, Sarah returned from a walk, clutching her belly, her face pale. She told me how the enforcer in crimson had stopped her at the corner, circling like a predator. "You're lowering the standards of this community," she'd hissed loud enough for passers-by. "Either you comply, or we'll make sure you don't belong here." That wasn't regulation talk anymore. That was exile. I felt the heat rising in my chest, the kind of rage my father always warned me about. He used to say anger can't build anything. It only destroys. But standing there on the porch, watching Sarah fold into herself under the neighbor's gaze, I realized destruction was exactly what Elaine had built her empire on, and the only way to counter it was by exposing her rot. By late afternoon, I drove past the clubhouse again. Workers, cheap contractors by the look of their trucks, were hauling in extension cords, patching wires along the sidewall, cover-up jobs, quick fixes. She already suspected I'd noticed the flaws. The tyrant in heels wasn't just arrogant, she was scared. I parked and got out, phone in hand, recording as casually as I could. One of the workers muttered under his breath, "These loads will never pass inspection." He didn't notice me jotting down the company name on the side of the van. Evidence, piece by piece. That night, Sarah sat by the oak tree in our front yard, the one Dad planted when I was a boy. She traced the bark with her fingers, like it was a lifeline. "Why do they hate me so much for existing?" she whispered. I knelt beside her, steadying her hands. "They don't hate you. They hate losing control. And right now, you're proof they don't control everything." Her eyes brimmed, but she nodded. The silence between us wasn't empty. It was resolve forming. When the sun dipped, another blow came. A certified letter slid into our mailbox. Notice of intent to fine. Daily non-compliance penalty of $500 a day. Until Sarah adjusted her appearance to align with standards. It was extortion in the language of bureaucracy, and if I let it slide, it would ruin us financially before our child was even born. But I wasn't rattled, not anymore. I had stood inside their clubhouse and seen its bones, and those bones were cracked. The oak tree cast a shadow across the lawn as I stared at the letter, my jaw tight. I thought of Dad again, his voice like steel. "Michael, buildings don't lie. People do. Always trust what the foundation tells you." And the foundation had spoken. That night, I made my decision. Elaine Winters could bury us in paper, bleed us with fines, turn neighbors into cowards, but the moment I brought her violations into daylight, she'd lose her throne. I spread my notes across the kitchen table, photos of scorched outlets, wiring errors, sprinkler misalignments. I wasn't just documenting flaws. I was building a case, one detail at a time. When Sarah asked if I was sure, I told her the truth. We can't just fight her. We have to break her system. Because now the stakes weren't abstract. They were daily, written in red ink, stamped in humiliation, echoed in the whispers of neighbors too afraid to stand up. And if Elaine thought this war would be won by shame, she'd never met a Carter backed against the wall. Tomorrow, I'd turn her fortress into her noose. The next morning, I spotted Tom Alvarez pacing outside the clubhouse. His tie was loose, his forehead damp despite the crisp air. The treasurer had always been Elaine's shadow, tallying her fines and signing her notices. But something about his posture screamed fracture. When his eyes met mine, he faltered. Then, instead of walking past, he crossed the lawn straight toward me. "I can't keep doing this," he muttered, voice low, eyes darting back toward the glass doors, where the clipboard queen was holding court with 2 board members. I said nothing, letting the silence pull at him. His hands fidgeted with his ledger like it was a shield he no longer believed in. "She's going too far, Michael. The fines, the flyers, this whole obsession with decency. It isn't policy. It's her vendetta. And if she keeps pushing, she's going to bury all of us." That last part wasn't about empathy for Sarah. It was fear of being dragged down with the tyrant in heels. I asked him, quiet but firm, "What do you mean by bury?" Tom swallowed hard. His gaze dropped to the ledger in his hands, then up to the oak tree at the edge of my yard, where Sarah sat on the porch with her tea. For a moment, guilt washed across his face. "There are contracts," he whispered, "unapproved ones, electrical systems, sprinkler retrofits, fire alarms." She bypassed inspections, cut corners, signed deals under the table. If any of it comes to light, the insurance company will void coverage. The whole neighborhood is one spark away from disaster. It hit me like a blueprint snapping into place. Elaine's empire wasn't built on authority. It was built on lies stitched together with fragile wiring. Tom's shoulders sagged, as if releasing the words cost him more than carrying them. I stayed quiet because I thought it was politics. Now I see it's madness, but you need to understand. If you use this, she'll come for me too. The enforcer in crimson stepped outside just then, her eyes scanning the lot. Tom flinched like a man caught stealing from his own pocket. I stepped forward, blocking her view, pretending to check my phone until she retreated back inside. When I turned back, Tom's eyes glistened with something between fear and relief. "Why tell me?" I asked. "Because you're the only one who can do something with it," he admitted. "You see the flaws. You understand what they mean. The rest of us just sign papers. You can break her." He slipped me a folded note from the ledger, quick and discreet. Contractor names, dates, payment discrepancies, proof of rot. Then he stepped back like a man who had just handed over a weapon and wanted nothing more than distance from it. As he walked away, I felt the weight settle into my palm. Not just evidence, responsibility. Back home, I spread the paper across the table with the photos I'd already taken. The pieces clicked together. The scorch marks, the rushed wiring jobs, the whispered doubts from contractors. This wasn't just negligence. It was a liability time bomb, waiting for the wrong spark to collapse the entire community. Sarah watched me, her voice steady but urgent. "What are you going to do with it?" I looked past her to the oak tree outside, Dad's legacy standing tall despite decades of storms. "I'm going to do what he taught me. I'm going to let the foundation speak." For the first time since this war began, I saw something shift in Sarah's face. Hope. Not naive, not fragile. A hope anchored in the knowledge that the board's queen had built her castle on sand. And Tom Alvarez, the man too scared to defy her, had just given me the shovel to dig up the truth. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time, the ground tilted in my favor. That night, I couldn't sleep. The papers Tom Alvarez slipped into my hand sat on the table like a live wire. Contractor names, discrepancies, payments routed through back channels. Each line told the same story. Shortcuts stacked like tinder, waiting for a single spark to set Brookhaven Meadows ablaze. I spread them beside the photos I'd taken of frayed wires, warped panels, and mismatched breakers. For years, I'd trained my eyes to read flaws the way others read words. My profession had been about saving lives before structures failed. Now, it would be about exposing how the clipboard queen gambled with all of ours. Sarah padded in quietly, a blanket around her shoulders. She set a mug of tea beside me, her hand brushing mine. "You've already found the cracks, haven't you?" she asked softly. I nodded. "They're everywhere. It's worse than I thought. And if this gets out, her throne won't just shake, it'll collapse." Sarah sat across from me, her eyes fierce despite exhaustion. "Then show them. Don't let her shame dictate the story. Make the truth louder." Her words tightened the resolve I'd already felt building. My late father used to say, "The strongest foundation isn't concrete, it's conviction." Looking out at the oak tree he planted decades ago, I knew this fight wasn't just mine. It was the Carter legacy, and it was Sarah's dignity. I sketched on a pad, building a map of her weak points. First, I'd need corroboration, voices beyond mine. Contractors who could confirm the jobs were rushed, uninspected, or outright falsified. Next, I'd secure evidence no one could deny. Photographs, code books, clear, as side-by-sides of what was required versus what she'd allowed. Finally, I'd time it so the exposure wasn't whispered between neighbors. It would be thunder at a public gathering. Elaine, the tyrant in heels, thrived on control through humiliation. That meant the only way to strip her power was to reverse the spectacle. Let the community see her empire not as pristine order, but as a fire trap cloaked in false authority. I reached for my phone, scrolling through old contacts, electrical engineers, safety inspectors, former colleagues who had walked the same construction sites I had. If I called in favors, I could piece together expert testimony without tipping my hand too early. Across the room, Sarah watched me with a mixture of pride and worry. Her voice trembled, but not from fear. "You're building something, aren't you?" "Yes," I said. "But this time, it's not a structure. It's a collapse plan." The enforcer in crimson had no idea yet that her treasurer had cracked, or that the very systems she manipulated would turn against her. Every illegal wire, every missing inspection, every penny pocketed would become a nail in her coffin. Still, there was risk. If she caught wind too soon, she'd smear me, bury Tom, maybe even force Sarah deeper into the spotlight. The plan had to be airtight, every step laid in sequence like load-bearing beams. I drafted the first moves. Secure testimony quietly from at least 2 contractors. Cross-reference building codes with the unapproved retrofits. Collect photographic evidence in a way that couldn't be contested. Use Tom's documents as the keystone, tying the whole scheme together. Each bullet point was another brick in the wall closing in on her. By dawn, the blueprint sat complete on the table. Lines, arrows, strategies inked with the precision of a man who had designed towers and bridges. But this wasn't steel or concrete. This was justice waiting to be set in motion. Sarah leaned her head on my shoulder, whispering, "Promise me one thing. Don't just win. Make them see what she really is." I kissed her forehead, feeling the weight of that vow. I promise. Because this fight wasn't about paperwork or fines anymore. It was about exposing the truth in daylight, where no smirk, no clipboard, no crimson jacket could disguise it. And when the moment came, Elaine Winters wouldn't be the judge of decency. She'd be the defendant of her own crimes. Preparation is one thing on paper. Executing it under the eyes of a tyrant is another. By morning, the blueprint I'd drawn at the dining table had to leave the safety of ink and become motion. The clipboard queen wouldn't give me long before tightening her grip. I started small. I drove past the clubhouse, slowing just enough to study its walls with the eyes of a builder. Hairline cracks ran across the stucco, branching like veins under paint. Electrical conduit sagged against the siding, improperly. Fastened, no doubt hidden with cosmetic plaster. To neighbors, it looked like nothing. To me, it screamed neglect. I snapped discreet photos through my tinted window, each click of the camera another nail in her fortress. Next stop. The old carpenter I'd worked with years ago, Frank. His shop smelled of sawdust and varnish, as unchanged as the man himself. Over black coffee, I showed him the images. He frowned, shaking his head. These wouldn't pass any inspection. Whoever signed off on them cut corners or got paid to look away. That line was gold. I recorded him, his gravelly voice carrying the weight of credibility. Witness number 1 secured. Later, I met with Lila, an electrical subcontractor I trusted. I pretended we were just catching up, but when I asked her to walk through Brookhaven's clubhouse with me as a favor, she agreed. Together, we spotted junction boxes without covers, wires bundled without grounding, and scorch marks near an overloaded breaker. Her muttered curse told me all I needed. She agreed to put her findings in writing, so long as I promised her anonymity until the hammer dropped. By evening, I had 2 professionals, dozens of photos, and Tom's documents, all pieces converging into a structure she couldn't escape. But the officer of rules wasn't resting either. Flyers appeared at every corner that night, stamped with bold lettering. Decency is order. Violators will be fined. Below it, Sarah's silhouette had been crudely sketched, unmistakable in its cruelty. My wife tore one down, hands trembling, the baby inside her shielded by her other palm. I burned with fury, but I couldn't let anger cloud strategy. Instead, I pulled her close. Every flyer they post is proof of harassment, I whispered. Let them build the case against themselves. Still, rage had its place. It fueled me as I spread our evidence across the oak table beneath my father's tree outside. The air smelled of grass and memory. That oak had withstood storms longer than I'd been alive. Tonight, it bore witness to a different storm, one I'd soon unleash. Neighbors began drifting by, silent at first. They pretended to admire the tree, but their eyes lingered on the papers in my hands. Whispers spread, Michael's fighting back. Something cracked in the silence of Brookhaven Meadows, the first stirrings of defiance. One neighbor, Mrs. Patel, leaned close enough to murmur, "She scares us. But if you're truly going to expose her, you won't stand alone." Her words weren't testimony, but they were momentum. Fear was bending, finally. That night, Tom Alvarez called me from a blocked number. His voice was ragged. "She suspects I've wavered. If she finds out I passed you anything, I'm finished." "Then let me carry it," I told him. "Stay quiet until the time comes. When it does, your role will matter more than mine." There was a long silence before he whispered, "You'd better win, Michael, because if you don't, she'll bury us all." I hung up knowing the risk had doubled, but the structure of my plan was no longer theory. It was steel rising from blueprints, evidence stacked like girders, witnesses braced like beams. Tom's confession would be the keystone. The tyrant in heels thought humiliation was her sharpest blade. She hadn't realized she'd handed me every tool I needed to dismantle her stage. And when the day came, I wouldn't just tear her house of lies down. I'd make sure the entire neighborhood saw the collapse live. The air in Brookhaven Meadows felt different that morning, heavy, charged, as if the neighborhood itself knew something was about to break. I woke before sunrise, laced my boots, and spread the evidence across my desk like a general preparing for war. Photos of cracked stucco, Frank's recorded testimony, Lila's signed inspection notes, flyers with Sarah's silhouette scrawled in red. Each piece of paper was a weapon sharper than any blade. I didn't work alone. Captain Ryan had arrived late the night before, his presence a quiet anchor. He didn't need to say much. Just the way he stood in uniform at the doorway was enough to remind me that bloodlines don't falter. He promised he wouldn't step in unless absolutely necessary, but I could see the fire in his eyes. My brother wasn't built for passivity, especially not when Sarah was involved. By mid-morning, the enforcer in crimson struck again. She paraded through the cul-de-sac in heels that cracked against the pavement like gunshots, clipboard raised as though it were a badge of honor. She posted another notice at the entrance gate. Mandatory compliance review. All residents required. Failure will result in penalties. It was a trap. She wanted me to resist, to make me look like the rebel standing against community order. But instead of tearing it down, I photographed it. The timestamp would prove she'd weaponized her position to coerce the entire neighborhood. Tom Alvarez shuffled into my yard minutes later, hands buried deep in his pockets. His eyes darted like a man on trial. "She called a board meeting tonight," he muttered. "Clubhouse, 8 sharp. She wants to make an example of you and Sarah." My pulse thudded, but I forced calm. "Then tonight," I said, we show the truth. Tom hesitated, sweat beading at his temple. If I speak, she'll know it was me who leaked those documents. I clasped his shoulder. Sometimes silence protects you, but tonight silence will destroy you. Stand with us, Tom, and the weight won't fall only on you. He didn't answer, but the flicker of resolve in his eyes told me he'd already decided. The clipboard queen wasn't finished. By afternoon, she sent a private security patrol door to door, handing out compliance tickets like candy. One of them shoved a slip at Sarah, warning her of fines for continued dress violations. She folded it without a word, but her trembling hand betrayed her fear. When she placed it on my desk, I stared at it like it was a fuse on dynamite. That was the last straw. I gathered every piece of evidence into a sealed binder, the kind no one could ignore. Then I called Lila, Frank, and Mrs. Patel. Be at the clubhouse tonight, I told them. Not as fighters, just as witnesses. The truth needs eyes. Ryan paced behind me as I rehearsed. She'll push hard, he warned. Don't let her bait you into rage. I nodded. My engineering career had taught me discipline. Structures don't collapse from one blow. They fall when stress builds, and weak points fail. Elaine Winters was a facade, a brittle wall held up by fear. Tonight, I'd apply the pressure where it mattered most. As dusk fell, neighbors began to drift toward the clubhouse. Normally, they shuffled with heads down, resigned to her rule. Tonight, they lingered, whispered, glanced at me as though measuring their chances. Fear was still there, but something stronger glimmered beneath it. Anticipation. The tyrant in heels appeared on the clubhouse steps, like an actress ready for her grand performance. Flashbulbs from cell phones lit the edges of the crowd. She smiled as if the show belonged to her. But in my binder, I carried the script that would rewrite everything. I stood beneath the oak tree one last time before heading out, palm pressed against its bark. My father's words echoed, "Protect what matters, no matter the cost." Tonight, that meant Sarah. It meant my unborn child. It meant Brookhaven Meadows itself. When I stepped away, Ryan fell into stride beside me. Tom Alvarez trailed close, face pale but jaw clenched. We walked toward the clubhouse as the sun bled red across the sky, the perfect curtain for the scene that was about to unfold. Every step tightened the coil. Every glance from my neighbors was another reminder. This wasn't just my fight anymore. By the time I reached those clubhouse doors, there was no turning back. The clubhouse smelled like dust and fluorescent heat when I walked in. Binder clutched tight under my arm. Folding chairs were jammed wall to wall, neighbors shoulder to shoulder, phones already glowing in their hands. Whispers crackled like static, rumors, doubts, fear that had lingered for years. Elaine Winters stood at the front, crimson blazer sharp against the stale beige walls. The clipboard queen held her gavel like a scepter, knuckles white, chin high. She didn't look at me at first. She didn't need to. Her eyes swept the crowd, savoring the silence like a conductor before a symphony. "This is a disciplinary hearing," she announced, voice sharp, rehearsed. "One household has repeatedly violated our decency code. Tonight, we decide they're standing in Brookhaven Meadows." Gasps rippled through the room. Sarah squeezed my hand from the front row, her belly pressing against the edge of her dress. My brother Ryan stood behind her, arms folded, uniform collar gleaming under the lights. He didn't speak, but his presence was thunder waiting to strike. I stepped forward, binder heavy in my grip. "Correction," I said, voice steady. "This isn't a hearing, this is a reckoning." The crowd murmured. Elaine's smile faltered just a fraction, then snapped back. "You have no standing here, Mr. Carter. This is board business." I dropped the binder onto the table. The sound cracked like a gunshot. Papers fanned out. Photos of faulty wiring, taped testimonies, inspection reports with her signature scrawled across them. "Then explain this," I said, loud enough for the back row. "Your clubhouse, the one you drag us into for humiliation, has fire hazards, illegal wiring, and structural code violations that could burn this neighborhood to ash." Lila Patel rose in the third row. "He's right. I was nearly fined for refusing to host meetings in there. She called me uncooperative." Elaine slammed her gavel, eyes darting. "Lies! Baseless accusations!" Ryan's voice cut the air, calm, military steel. I inspected the photos myself. If this building were on a base, it would have been condemned months ago. Gasps swelled louder. Phones tilted higher. And then Tom Alvarez stood. His hands shook, but his voice carried across the silence. I signed her citations. I enforced her fines. But I also kept the notes she told me to destroy. He lifted a folded slip of paper, shaking as he held it out. She told us to teach them fear. Those were her words. Not order, not safety, fear. The room erupted. Shouts, anger. Mrs. Alvarez stood, voice breaking. "She fined my boy for a t-shirt logo," Mr. Chen's voice thundered next. "She threatened to strip my voting rights for chalk drawings." Elaine's mask cracked. Her crimson face flushed under the fluorescent glare. She raised her gavel, desperate for control. "You people don't understand. Without me, this neighborhood falls apart. Property values will plummet." The inspector I'd called earlier stepped forward from the back, badge glinting. His voice cut sharper than hers ever had. Brookhaven Meadows Incorporation lapsed nearly 2 years ago. Every enforcement action since is invalid. Effective immediately, this board's authority is suspended pending county review. Silence, heavy, suffocating. And then it broke like glass. Neighbors surged to their feet, clapping, shouting, some crying openly. Phones flashed, capturing every second. Elaine staggered back, her gavel slipping from her fingers, clattering uselessly onto the table. The tyrant in heels who once ruled with a smirk and clipboard now looked small, just a woman, cornered by truth. Ryan stepped closer, his shadow falling over her. "Order built on fear isn't order," he said. "It's tyranny, and tyranny never stands." Tom Alvarez dropped his affidavit onto the pile of evidence, his voice steady now. "I won't cover for her anymore. None of us should." The crowd roared. Someone shouted, "No more rulers! We want neighbors!" And the chant caught like wildfire. I turned to Sarah. Her eyes shimmered, but this time not from humiliation. She pressed my hand to her belly, whispering, "You kept your promise." I faced the room, the oak tree outside flashing in my memory. This isn't about one dress. It's about dignity, family, freedom, and tonight we take it back. Applause thundered, rattling the windows. Elaine sank into her chair, trembling, powerless. The clipboard queen had finally been dethroned. The next morning, Brookhaven Meadows didn't feel like the same neighborhood. Sunlight poured across manicured lawns, but for the first time in years, it didn't feel staged. It felt alive. Curtains were open, not hiding. Neighbors walked their dogs without glancing nervously over their shoulders. Kids darted across driveways, chalk streaking the sidewalks with color no one would dare erase. Elaine's SUV still sat in her driveway, but it wasn't a throne anymore. The clipboard queen had been stripped of her gavel, her authority dissolved with a single county ruling and the voice of a community finally awake. I watched from the porch as people passed her house without flinching. Her crimson armor, once a symbol of fear, was now just fabric. Sarah rocked slowly on the porch swing, her hands resting on her belly. The chain creaked in rhythm, the same sound I remembered from childhood nights when my father sat there, reading me stories under the oak tree he'd planted. That tree stood taller now, roots deep, branches wide, a witness to the storm we'd endured. Ryan stood in the yard, uniform crisp even off duty, hammering a wooden sign into the grass. Painted in bold letters, Community Rebuild Meeting, tonight, 6 p.m. Beneath it, clipboards waited for names. Tom Alvarez had already signed first. His shoulders looked lighter, his eyes no longer darting with guilt. Neighbors came one by one. Mrs. Alvarez brought lemonade and whispered, "We finally slept last night." Mr. Chen handed Ryan a stack of lanterns for the evening, muttering, "Let the light stay on this time." Small offerings, but each one felt like a brick laid in the foundation of something real. I walked over, pressing my name onto the sheet. Sarah followed, her steps slow but steady. When she added hers, the crowd went quiet. For months, she'd been their symbol of humiliation. Her dress mocked, her pregnancy turned into a weapon. Today, she was their symbol of resilience. Someone clapped, then another. The sound spread, warm and steady, not for me, not for Ryan, but for her. As the sun dipped behind the oak tree, the lawn filled with folding chairs and the kind of food neighbors hadn't shared in years. Children weaved between tables, laughter ringing out where silence once ruled. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't fixed overnight, but it was different. And different meant hope. Ryan raised his voice over the crowd. We've seen what happens when power hides behind rules. Now we decide what happens when neighbors stand together. No rulers, no fear, just people who care about the place they live. The applause that followed wasn't furious or explosive. It was steady, like a heartbeat echoing across every house. I glanced at Sarah. Her smile was small but real. The wound of humiliation hadn't vanished, but she wasn't carrying it alone anymore. She leaned against me, whispering, "You kept your father's promise." I looked at the oak, its roots wrapped around the soil where my father's ashes rested. The same ground where I'd sworn I'd protect my family, no matter the cost. Last night, with papers and courage and one brother's steel, we had. Elaine Winters tried to strip my wife of dignity in front of our neighbors. Instead, she stripped herself of every ounce of power she thought she owned. Her clipboard, her fines, her threats. They were nothing against the weight of truth and the unity of people who decided fear was no longer welcome here. I stepped forward, addressing the crowd gathered under the lanterns. This neighborhood doesn't belong to one person. It belongs to all of us. And as long as we stand together, no board, no title, no clipboard can take that away. The cheer that followed wasn't just noise. It was release. A breaking of chains. A beginning. Later that night, Sarah tugged my sleeve gently. "It's really over, isn't it?" I crouched beside her, the porch light glowing above. It's over for her, but for us, this is the start. We get to build something better. Something our kids will grow up proud of. Her hand pressed mine against her stomach. For the first time since the humiliation began, her eyes weren't clouded by shame. They were clear, steady, alive. I turned back to the crowd, to the neighbors laughing under the oak tree, to Ryan standing tall beside Tom, to children drawing in chalk without fear of fines. And I knew Brookhaven Meadows had finally taken its first breath of freedom. Stories like this prove we're stronger together. Subscribe now to join the fight. Share your story below and let me know where you're watching from. I want to hear every voice. Elaine's empire was ash. Ours was just beginning.